54 kilometers an hour, then 0, June 12, 2019. A quiet residential street in Rouen, France. The most successful Grand Tour rider of his generation is warming up for a time trial he will never start. He takes one hand off the handlebars to clear his nose. A gust of wind catches his front wheel, and the data unit on his bicycle records the exact moment a dynasty ends, 54 kilometers an hour, into the wall of a house, to a dead stop. By that morning, Chris Froome had won 7 Grand Tours. 1 year earlier, he had done something no rider had managed in 35 years. He held the yellow jersey of the Tour, the pink jersey of the Giro, and the red jersey of the Vuelta at the same time. He was 34 years old, and he was preparing for a record-tying 5th Tour de France. He would never win another race. Not a tour, not a stage, not anything. 7 years later, on the eve of the 2026 Tour de France, he finally said the word out loud: retired. So what really happened to Chris Froome? Not the headline version, the real one. That is exactly what we are here to find out. Because the story does not begin in Europe. It begins on the red dirt roads above Nairobi. Chris Froome was born in Kenya in May of 1985 and raised, for a time, in a one-bedroom flat with his mother, Jane. She was the one who pushed him toward the bicycle. And the man who taught him what a bicycle could be was David Kinja, a Kenyan professional with a village cycling club called the Safari Simfads. From the age of 12, Froome trained with them, the skinny white kid who spoke Swahili, chasing grown Kenyan racers along rough highland roads and coming back for more, day after day. Nothing about the path that followed was normal. School in South Africa, a start in Europe with no federation behind him, no famous junior results, no pedigree, and a body that kept failing him for reasons nobody could name, until doctors finally found bilharzia, a tropical parasite living in his blood, quietly stealing a piece of every season. It would not be the last time his body wrote the story. And there was grief. Weeks before his first Tour de France, in 2008, his mother died of cancer. The woman who had started all of it never saw him ride it. He rode his first tour in mourning and finished it almost unnoticed. Then in 2011, riding as a domestique at the Vuelta a España, the unnoticed man suddenly rode the best stage racers in the world off his wheel and finished second overall. Years later, the record books would quietly turn that second place into a victory. On the road, though, nobody yet understood what they were looking at. Europe had no idea what was coming. In truth, neither did his own team. Here's what the record says. Not 1 Tour de France, not 2. 4 in 5 seasons, 2013, 2015, 2016, 2017. In the autumn of 2017, he added the Vuelta a España, and in the spring of 2018, the Giro d'Italia. Which meant that for one moment in May of 2018, Chris Froome held all 3 Grand Tour titles at the same time. Only 2 other men in the history of this sport had ever done that, Eddy Merckx and Bernard Hinault. Nobody had done it since 1983. Read that again. In the era of marginal gains, of specialized calendars, of races decided by seconds, one rider held the Tour, the Giro, and the Vuelta at once. The full ledger would eventually read 7 Grand Tours, because in 2019, the record books finished what the road had started. The Vuelta of 2011, where he had finished second, was awarded to him after the original winner was struck from the results. And he built all of it while looking, by common agreement, completely wrong. The elbows out, the head low, the eyes locked on the power meter instead of the road. Commentators called the style ugly, mechanical, unwatchable. The results called it something else. It was not ugly, it was inevitable. He rode at a cadence nobody could copy, to numbers most of his rivals preferred not to believe. Rivals studied his data files, coaches studied the cadence, nobody reproduced either. That disbelief became its own war. In 2015, at the peak of the abuse, Froome did something almost no champion in this sport had ever volunteered to do. He flew to an independent laboratory, had his physiology measured from the inside out, and published the results for the world to read. But numbers were never Froome's real problem. Belief was. Because Chris Froome won in the shadow of a sport that had burned its believers before. He inherited the suspicion aimed at every dominant rider since the scandals of the 1990s, and he inherited it at full strength. In July of 2015, on stage 14 of the Tour, a spectator stepped toward the race leader and threw a cup of urine into his face, shouting one word: doper. Froome described it to the BBC that evening, with the yellow jersey still on his shoulders. Unfortunately, he said, someone threw a cup of urine into my face and shouted doper, which is extremely wrong on so many different levels. He was spat at. He was booed on podiums he had earned. Then, in December of 2017, the storm found its legal form. A test sample from the Vuelta, a race he had just won, showed salbutamol, an asthma medication he was permitted to use, above the threshold that triggers an investigation. For 10 months, the case hung over him. the governing body of world cycling on one side, the biggest name in the sport on the other, and the Tour's own organizers trying to keep him away from the start line. On July 2nd, 2018, the case closed. The UCI dropped it and the World Anti-Doping Agency accepted the decision. No violation, no adverse finding. On that question, the record is not ambiguous, it is adjudicated. But by the time the paperwork cleared his name, Froome had already answered in the only language he ever fully trusted. 5 weeks earlier, on a gravel mountain in Piedmont, he had given this sport a day it still cannot quite explain. 3 days tell you who Chris Froome was on a bicycle. The first is La Toussuire, 2012. Froome had been hired as a domestique, the loyal engine for Bradley Wiggins, the team's designated leader. Mid-climb, mid-tour, Froome accelerated, and within seconds his own leader, the man about to win the Tour de France, was in difficulty behind him. The order that came through the radio was not about their rivals. It was one word: wait. He waited. He finished that tour in second place, one step below a man he had been strong enough to drop. The second is Mont Ventoux, 2016. Bastille Day, a mountain so packed with fans the race could barely pass. A television motorbike stopped dead in the crowd. Froome, in yellow, slammed into the back of it and his bicycle was destroyed. What happened next produced one of the most surreal images in the history of the Tour de France. The race leader, alone, running up Mont Ventoux in cycling shoes, no bicycle, through a canyon of screaming spectators. The jury restored his time and his jersey. The image stayed. The maillot jaune, running. The third is the Col de la Finestre, May 25th, 2018, stage 19 of the Giro. Froome sat 4th overall, more than 3 minutes behind, the salbutamol case still open above his head. 80 kilometers from the finish, on the gravel switchbacks of the Finestre, he attacked, alone. His team had planned it like a heist, bottles staged along the route, the pace calculated to the watt. 40 seconds at the summit became more than 3 minutes at the line. He took the stage, the pink jersey, and the Giro in one single afternoon. Froome himself put it more simply: I have never attacked that far from the finish line. It is just something you do not see very often anymore in professional cycling. That was the summit of the race and of the life. And from the summit, every road runs down. 13 months later came Roanne, June 12, 2019. Not a battle, not a mountain descent in the rain. A routine reconnaissance ride before a time trial at the Critérium du Dauphiné, on a straight piece of road with houses on either side. Froome signaled to his teammate Wout Poels, took one hand off the bars to clear his nose, and a gust of wind took his front wheel. Dave Brailsford, the team principal who had built the dynasty around him, described the telemetry in one sentence: "We have had a look at his data, and he went from 54 kilometers an hour to a dead stop." The bill was catastrophic: an open fracture of the right femur, a broken elbow, broken ribs, a fractured vertebra in his neck. The surgeon who rebuilt him revealed that Froome had lost roughly 2 liters of blood, close to half of what a human body holds, and spent 6 hours on the operating table. He was 34. The doctors spoke about walking long before anyone spoke about racing. He chose racing. This is the part of the story where most legends stop, and Froome refused. He came back in 2020, left the team of all his victories, and signed with Israel Premier Tech on one of the largest contracts in the sport, a team betting that the old Froome was still in there somewhere. The record of the next 5 seasons is quiet and brutal. 6 top 20 finishes in 5 years. His final Grand Tour was the Vuelta of 2022, finished in 114th place. By 2024, he did not score a single ranking point all season. The owner of his team, asked whether the signing had been worth the money, answered with 2 words: absolutely not. And yet once, on one July afternoon in 2022, on the 1 hairpins of Alpe d'Huez, the old silhouette reappeared. Elbows out, head low, 3rd place on the most famous climb in the sport, and a crowd finally, unmistakably, on his side. It was not a comeback, it was a farewell that nobody thought to label. Then, in late August of 2025, on a training ride near Saint Raphael, he struck a road sign at speed. He was airlifted to a hospital in Toulon, 5 broken ribs, a fractured vertebra in his lower back, a collapsed lung, and damage to the lining of his heart that required surgery. He was 40 years old and he was still trying to be a bike racer. The body that had carried him from Nairobi to the top of all 3 Grand Tours had finally formally said no. Froome paid the road's price all at once at 54 kilometers an hour. Most people who love this sport pay it in smaller coins. Anyone still riding past 40 knows the ledger. The Sunday Club Run, the local Grand Fondo, the same climb chased a little slower every summer, the knees that complain a day longer than they used to, the lower back that sets like concrete after 2 hours. The hands that go numb on the drops, the ache that arrives a little earlier every season. That ache has an explanation, a specific and recent one that almost nobody in cycling talks about. And this video is not the place where it gets explained. It has its own. It sits pinned as the very first comment under this one, and it asks for nothing but a few minutes before your next ride. Froome, for his part, never got to negotiate with his own body. It simply decided. So how does the sport remember a champion it never quite embraced? Listen to the people who watched him from inside the race. Dave Brailsford, the architect of the strongest team of the era and a man not given to sentiment, said it while Froome was still in a hospital bed. One of the things which sets Chris apart is his mental strength and resilience. The veterans of the Giro press room, men who had spent their whole lives around the race, reached past Merckx, past Hinault, all the way back to 1949 for the only comparison they considered fair. The closest one, they said, is with Fausto Coppi. David Kinja, the mentor who first towed a 12-year-old Froome up the climbs outside Nairobi, spent 2 decades telling anyone who would listen what that boy proved. That the greatest stage racer of his generation had come from a place professional cycling had never once thought to look. Even the cold verdict of his final employer tells you something. The owner admitted, in public, that the money was never repaid, and kept him in the team's colors anyway, because a jersey with Chris Froome's name in it still meant something. And Froome himself, when it was finally over, in the summer of 2026, needed only a handful of words. Unfortunately, there was that crash last summer, he said. That was not the way I wanted it to end. But even then, I knew it was over. He had known since the hospital bed. He simply could not say it until the tour came around again without him. So, what really happened to Chris Froome? Nothing was hidden. That is the answer, and it is the hardest one for a sport raised on conspiracy to accept. The one formal accusation ever brought against him was examined for 10 months and closed with no violation. There was no scandal at the end, no secret, no fall from grace. What ended Chris Froome was a gust of wind on an ordinary street, one moment of ordinary human frailty at 54 kilometers an hour. And what followed was not decline as surrender. It was 7 years of a man refusing to read an ending the entire world had already read. He remains the last man of his era to hold all 3 Grand Tours at once, and the record now waits for someone braver than the calendar. The wall in Rouen stopped the champion in 1 second. It took the man 7 more years to stop pedaling. If cycling's great stories deserve more than a headline, subscribe and follow the next one. Then leave a comment below. Which ride is Chris Froome to you? The 80 kilometers alone on the Finestre, or the run-up Mont Ventoux with no bicycle at all? The red dirt roads above Nairobi are still there, so is the record.